St. Petersburg felt, for a few hours, like the diplomatic front line. In a formal hall not far from the Baltic, Iran's top diplomat met with the man who leads Russia, an encounter that, in a single afternoon, crystallized how quickly regional tensions have recalibrated alliances and how perilously close those alignments now sit to the prospect of wider confrontation. The meeting between Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Russian President Vladimir Putin came against a backdrop of recent strikes, rising rhetoric, and an international atmosphere thick with warning and counter-warning. From Tehran to Washington, messages about restraint and resolve were being sent and decoded simultaneously in the corridors of power in Moscow. The signals were meant to be unmistakable. Russia intends to stand with Iran. Abbas Araghchi said, "Mr. President, I am very happy to see you again in the beautiful city of St. Petersburg." He continued, "Mr. President, I would like to thank you for congratulating us on the election of our new leader. Those formal courtesies were not mere niceties. They were the opening notes of a conversation whose subtext reached far beyond ceremony, a confirmation of political ties and a deliberate public signaling that Tehran and Moscow were drawing closer at a moment when the United States and its partners were sharpening their responses." In blunt, repeated language, the Iranian delegation stressed continuity. Abbas Araghchi said, Iranian-Russian relations will continue no matter what happens. The line was both reassurance and a provocation, depending on who listened. For Tehran, it was a statement of strategic calm, a claim that despite pressure, sanctions, or even military strikes, the partnership with Moscow endures. For Washington and its allies, it was a reminder that any pressure campaign on Iran now runs up against a geopolitical partner with its own global ambitions and its own reasons to resist American influence. The rhetoric had not come from a vacuum. Days before the visit, Iran had moved rapidly through a series of domestic and international shocks, an early election that brought a new president to power, tensions inflamed by strikes attributed to US-Israel and Israeli forces, and an extraordinary domestic political moment that changed Tehran's own leadership dynamic. Moscow, watching those shifts, chose to make its response visible. The Russian president, as he greeted the Iranian delegation, framed Russia's posture in regional terms and in language meant to be unequivocal. Vladimir Putin said, "We will do our best to take all necessary actions in order to benefit the people of our two countries, the people of the entire region, and to establish peace." That pledge, cast as a defense of mutual interests and regional stability, was at once broad and purposeful. It signaled political cover, a public commitment that Russia would not stand aside as Tehran navigated one of the most volatile stretches in its history. The phrasing left room for diplomacy and for action. For Russia's part, it allowed the Kremlin to insist its motives were tied to peace and to the welfare of ordinary people, even as the practical consequences of that posture could mean closer security cooperation, diplomatic shielding in international fora, or harder-edged deterrence against adversaries. The Iranians emphasized gratitude, and they framed that gratitude as mutual. Abbas Araghchi said, "I would like to ask you to convey my sincerest thanks for this, to confirm that Russia, as well as Iran, intend to continue our strategic relations." The repetition in his remarks, gratitude, confirmation, and strategic framing, underscored a clear political line. These are not transactional ties for a moment, but a partnership intended to endure through a period of high tension. The public tone and private choreography mattered in equal measure. For Moscow, supporting Tehran pays multiple dividends. It rebukes what the Kremlin portrays as Western coercion. It deepens Russia's influence in a region still central to global energy and security dynamics, and it complicates any calculations in Washington about the costs of further pressure or military action. For Tehran, the political value is obvious. As Araghchi put it plainly, it has also become clear that the Iranian people have friends like Russia who stand by Iran in difficult conditions. That simple sentence, awkward in construction but direct in intent, was intended to convey to domestic audiences and to regional actors that Iran is not isolated. Those lines, repeated and amplified by state media, are part of a larger narrative being written in real time. Since the new Iranian presidency took office following the snap election last year, Tehran has balanced outreach with defiance, signaling a willingness to engage in talks under certain conditions while simultaneously affirming its defensive and deterrent capabilities. Russia's public embrace, friend. And the Kremlin's explicit condemnation of US and Israeli strikes reconfigures the risk calculus. Washington cannot assume unilateral pressure will produce predictable results if adversaries have credible external partners prepared to blunt or complicate those moves. The Russian argument, voiced in different terms by officials and carried by the president's remarks, emphasizes sovereignty and balance. Putin framed Moscow's posture as a defensive interest in regional stability and in preventing the conflict from spiraling. Yet, the optics were unmistakably strategic. Russia is now positioned as a diplomatic shield for Tehran on the global stage. That role includes public statements castigating strikes attributed to the United States and Israel, and it likely includes deeper channels of communication and material cooperation behind closed doors. Beyond the high protocol phrases, the meeting whetted a broader set of questions. What does a closer Russia-Iran alignment mean for the pre-R? Aspects of diplomacy with Washington, how will regional actors respond? And what are the constraints on Moscow's ability to deliver the kind of comprehensive support Tehran might want? On the diplomatic front, the evidence of continued engagement between Washington and Tehran has been uneven but real. There have been intermittent direct contacts and mediated exchanges, a pattern of cautious engagement mixed with robust deterrence. Araghchi's diplomacy in recent months included conversations with a range of international interlocutors, and his trip to St. Petersburg was part of a broader shuttle that sought to keep lines open while reinforcing alliances. There were echoes in the Russian press of an older, familiar script, the portrayal of a Western campaign to isolate Tehran and the counter-narrative of multipolar resistance. To many in Moscow, the US policy of maximum pressure looked like a destabilizing gamble, and the Kremlin's intervention in support of Iran was cast as a corrective posture intended to preserve its own influence in a region where Russian presence has waxed and waned over decades, but support has limits and trade-offs. Russia's resources are finite. Moscow faces its own economic and military commitments elsewhere. Any public embrace of Iran must be balanced against the Kremlin's relationships with other regional powers, with energy markets, and with an international community wary of escalations. Even as Moscow offers public cover, it seeks to avoid a direct military confrontation with the United States. But that means most Russian support is likely to be diplomatic shielding, political framing, and selective material assistance calibrated to avoid tipping the region into conflagration. Tehran's calculus is equally careful. Officials in Iran want to project resilience and continuity. The pairing of public gratitude and strategic talk is intended to strengthen domestic resolve, to show citizens that Iran has powerful friends who will not allow it to stand alone. At the same time, Iran's leaders are acutely aware of the asymmetric dangers posed by a direct strike from the United States or a widening campaign led by Israel. In this sense, the Moscow embrace is as much about deterrence as it is about alliance building. Inside the room, the ceremonial language occasionally gave way to a sharper, more pointed tone. Araghchi returned repeatedly to a theme of shared struggle and common purpose. Abbas Araghchi said, "We see how courageously and heroically the people of Iran fight for their independence and sovereignty." He framed Iran's position not as expansionist, but as defensive, a people resisting pressure and committed to their own political trajectory. Whether international audiences accept that frame depends on their view of the recent incidents that have escalated tensions across the region. Whatever the immediate optics, both sides also sought to thread a needle, highlight solidarity, but leave diplomatic doors open. Russia, for its part, continued to insist on the language of negotiation and restraint, even as it issued sharper rebukes of Western actions. Iran insisted on its right to self-defense and sovereignty, while at times extending indications that talks could be resumed under less coercive conditions. Within this complex diplomatic tapestry, the question of leadership in Tehran has itself been a variable. A new president in Tehran reshapes internal alignment and the way the state projects policy externally. The Russian reception, including public congratulations from Moscow, was aimed at cementing a relationship with the newly organized Iranian leadership. It matters in diplomatic practice to be among the first to acknowledge and embrace a new government. The gestures build reciprocal obligations and expectations. For an audience listening at home, the immediate takeaways are clear. First, Russia has made a deliberate choice to amplify its political and diplomatic support for Iran at a moment strain. Second, Iran is leaning into that support as part of a resilient strategy intended to blunt isolation. Third, the worldwide implications are significant. A US strategy that assumes Tehran will be isolated, or that isolation can be sustained without a border cost, now faces a stiffer geopolitical hurdle. None of this means the path ahead is predetermined. Diplomatic openings remain possible. Back channels and mediated talks have intermittently surfaced over recent months. Yet the public choreography in St. Petersburg was designed for global consumption. Leaders in both capitals wanted their constituencies to understand the message. An axis of convenience and interest has hardened, and it will complicate any move that assumes unilateral leverage. The language of peace that both sides used does still matter. Both Putin and Araghchi couched their commitments in terms of benefiting ordinary people and stabilizing the region. But beneath those Araghchi's lies a strategic calculation about deterrence, leverage, and the balance of influence. If those calculations hold, the near-term effect is likely to be a more robust Iranian diplomatic posture and a more vocal Russian resistance to Western actions that Moscow deems destabilizing. As the meeting closed and cameras filed out, the public record remained the record. Statements, photographs, and a set of quotations that will be replayed across state and international media. Abbas Araghchi said, "I would like to ask you to convey my sincerest thanks for this, to confirm that Russia, as well as Iran, intend to continue our strategic relations. Those words will be cited by both Tehran and Moscow as evidence of a permanent shift. By others, they will be warned about as the next step toward a harder diplomatic standoff." The broader question now is whether these carefully staged affirmations will become the scaffolding of an enduring strategic partnership, or whether they will instead decay, own temporary cover while cooler heads on all sides seek a path back to negotiations. The likelihood is that the answer will be a mixture, elements of cooperation that endure, moments of sharp confrontation that threaten to widen, and periods of delicate diplomacy that try to hold the lid on escalation. For listeners and viewers, the scene in St. Petersburg should be read as a warning against assuming simplicity in a complicated international moment. Alliances are being tested and reforged, and the arithmetic of power has shifted in ways that demand attention. The meeting was theatrical by design, but the consequences are substantive. Partners made promises in plain sight, and those promises will shape the next chapters of a regional crisis that carries global stakes,